The Dirty Cats of Boggle Hole. Chapter 2. Trapped on the Beach. The seagull swooped down on Tim for the second time. He moved closer to the gully where he was pressed hard against the rock face. He thought if this blasted seagull would let him, he could just get round the rock and up to the door. He had first seen the door when he burst out of the forest growth and fell out onto the beach. After he'd lost Nick and the others, and Ellie, he'd decided that, as the general idea had been to get to the beach, maybe, if he could get there first, he could surprise the others when they got there. This was why he hadn't taken the path down. After scrambling down through the undergrowth and one or two small rocky outcrops, he eventually came to the beach. He hadn't expected the beach so soon, and he literally fell onto the sand. He hadn't hurt himself, and he quickly stood up and looked around. It seemed that there was a small stream that came down the valley through the forest and met the sea here. He'd wondered earlier if this was the case, as most valleys like this would have a stream of some kind. He walked up to the edge of the mouth of the stream. It wasn't very deep, maybe 6 inches or so, but the current was very strong. His eyes followed the length of the stream inland to the cliffs, and that's when he first saw the door. The cliff froze quite dramatically, and as the stream came out of the forest, it cascaded down a small waterfall, which was about 10 or 12 feet high at most. The effect was quite spectacular. However, just on the beach side of the waterfall, in one of the many gullies in the cliff face, there was a large solid door set into the rock. It looked as if it belonged to a castle or something like that, rather than just set into a cliff. Tim's first thought, naturally enough for him, was to go and try the door to see if it would open. As he hurried up the beach, just as he approached the door, the seagull had swooped at him. He was suddenly aware of the rushing of air, the flapping of wings, and a long, very sharp-looking yellow beak that passed inches from his face. My goodness, he thought, that was close. At first he'd presumed that maybe he was near a nest or some young birds when the bird came down, but the second time he got the definite impression that it was somehow trying to stop him from reaching the door. The third time confirmed this when it swooped straight at him just as he tried to edge carefully round the rocks. When it swooped down for a fourth time, and this time it let out a death-defying scream, its beak caught Tim across the cheek and drew blood. "Hey, get off me!" Tim yelled as he fell back against the cliff. What happened next is very difficult for anyone to remember clearly. Nick, Joe and Emma heard and immediately recognised Tim's voice shouting for the seagull to get off. They ran down the path, Nick holding Emma's hand and Joe running behind. They sped round the next corner, but didn't expect the wooden steps that led down to the beach. "Over here!" someone cried. Emma and Nick fell headlong down the steps onto the beach. Joe, who managed to grab the handrail at the top, just stopped himself from falling down the steps. However, ironically, it gave him a perfect viewpoint from which he could watch the next wave. It crashed up onto the beach and drew back just as quickly, taking Nick and Emma with it. Joe was dumbfounded. "Nick! Emma!" he cried, to no avail. He couldn't see them anywhere, nor could he see any trace of Tim or where his voice had come from. "Nick! Tim! Emma!" he cried desperately. He shouted and shouted. Nothing. Joe felt very alone. What could he do? The sea was crashing up and down the beach with such ferocity that he dared not try and swim. Not that he was a good swimmer. he did know that Nick and Tim were both excellent swimmers, and he can only hope that one or both of them had been able to grab Emma before it was too late. Joe ran back up the path a little and tried to go back down to the beach through the undergrowth. He went as far as he dared, but he knew from what he had seen from the steps that there were a lot of rocky cliffs and he had to be careful. It was because of this that he found himself at the top of a sheer drop into a gully down to the beach. It was about 20 feet high. Joe considered the gloomy depth, carefully peering over the edge. In the semi-darkness he could see very little, except the white tops of the waves where they broke. This told him that there was no water at the very inside of the gully. "Joe!" a voice from below shouted. "Tim, where are you?" he shouted back, recognising the voice at once. "Down here! Can you see me?" Tim asked from below. Joe looked carefully. "Yes, only just. What about Nick and Emma?" "Hang on a minute, I'm coming up." Tim began to climb up the tightest end of the gully by carefully placing his feet on one side and his back and arms on the other and pushing hard. He remembered trying bridging at rock climbing club and had been reasonably successful. There was no reason why this shouldn't work, he thought. It's the same principle. He began to edge his way up, slowly. "For goodness sake, be careful," Joe shouted. Tim didn't reply, as it took all of his concentration to maintain his precarious position. After what seemed like an age, he reached the top. It was, in fact, only about 2 or 3 minutes. Tim climbed onto the top and collapsed next to Joe. He felt the urge to go and give him a hug, as he was so relieved to see him safe. It was then that Joe noticed his face was bleeding quite badly. "What happened?" he asked. "Oh, this. Nothing serious, but quick. We must get back down to the steps." "What is it, Tim? Where are Nick and—" Before Joe had finished the question, Tim had run off in the direction of the steps. Tim turned and shouted, "Come on, Joe, quick!" They hurried back to the steps. As they got there, they could see that the sea had dropped down to the beach again. They could get to the bottom of the steps safely. They stopped at the bottom and peered cautiously into the growing darkness around them. "Hang on," Joe said. "I've got a torch." Tim laughed. "I might have known that if anyone had one, you would." "What about Nick and Emma?" Joe asked anxiously. Tim put his fingers to his lips and moved back to the edge of the cliff, flat against the rock. He gestured for Joe to do the same. Tim edged slowly along the beach in this careful manner. It was obvious from this that Tim knew that they were not the only ones on the beach, besides Nick and Emma. They turned into a narrow gully where the sea had reached right up into it. As Joe turned to look, he saw the door. "What on earth is that?" he asked Tim. "Shh," insisted Tim. "That's where they went. Something pulled them inside. I saw it," he whispered. "I saw them being picked up by the sea like rag dolls, dragged up into this gully. I was there behind that rock." He pointed vaguely across the beach. "I was just about to go and try to get to them when they were dragged in by someone through the door." "So it was you that we heard shouting over here when we were on the beach," reasoned Joe. "No, I didn't. That wasn't me. Anyway, we must open the door and look for them. We'll be able to wade through this water. It's not so deep now, and the tide seems to have dropped a bit." They carefully made their way up to the door. The water was indeed only inches deep by the door. Joe shone his torch over it. It was a large, old door with massive iron hinges and ring handles with a latch. Tim tried to open the door by lifting the latch, but it wouldn't budge. He examined the latch carefully to see if there was anything stopping it. There wasn't, not even a lock. They both tried for a while, but they couldn't shift it. They were wondering what to do when Joe suddenly remembered something. "Biggles said there was a door. I heard him." "Who on earth is Biggles?" Tim asked. Joe explained the whole story from when they first got caught in his eyes, when they had met him, when he had started to talk to them, if that's what it was, and when he had disappeared. Joe told it as best he could remember it. Tim was quiet and very thoughtful. "Can you remember exactly what he said just before he disappeared?" he asked Joe. "Yes, I think it was something about getting there before the door closes." "Must be some kind of time lock," Tim thought aloud. "Of course," he exclaimed, "when the tide is in, the door would have to remain locked as the current is so strong. It would probably stay locked until the tide goes out again." "How long do we have to wait?" Joe asked. "Not long now, I wouldn't think," Tim replied. "Still, it could be a little while, so let's get back to the steps and wait there." They retreated to the steps, and they could see from the whiteness of the waves as they crashed onto the rocks that the tide was receding. They sat down at the bottom steps and leaned against the rock. "Mum and Dad will be worrying about us," Joe said. "Yes, I know, but by the time we can get all the way back up the path, even if we could in the dark, we might be too late to save Nick and Emma. We'd better stay here and try and get in the door when it opens." Joe was a little relieved because he knew that Tim was both practical and he thought things through. If anyone could help Nick and Emma now, Tim was the best person to do it. As time progressed, they both became very drowsy. After the recent excitement, they were both tired. It wasn't long before they both dropped off into an uneasy and fitful sleep.